I'm delighted to welcome you to today's conversation with Ursula Goodenough, where we'll be exploring themes arising from her newly reissued book, The Sacred Depths of Nature. So it was around 25 years ago when Ursula, who was then a professor of biology at Washington University, first published this book, The Sacred Depths of Nature. And the book was really at the forefront of a conceptual revolution in the sciences, because really for generations, pretty much through the whole century, it was kind of prohibited for a biologist to use a word like sacred in describing how life was composed. In the very beginning of the 20th century, there was this famous biochemist called Jacques Monod, who summarized this statement that kind of rang through the ages. He said, "Any mingling of knowledge with values is unlawful, forbidden." And now here's this leading biologist at a renowned academic institution actually boldly putting the word sacred in the title of a book about life, about the structures of life. And for me, this book actually has deep personal resonance and meaning, because it was about 20 years ago that I began basically like a long multi-year research project that led to my two books, The Patterning Instinct and The Web of Meaning. And as I began that research, I was determined that whatever I did to try to understand where meaning came from in life had to be scientifically valid. I didn't want to just reject science. And so I started off with the mainstream narratives of picking up people like Richard Dawkins, who basically told me I was just a machine. I'm dominated by these selfish genes, and that's all there is to it. And I didn't want to give up on science, but that didn't feel right. But I was lucky enough to come across Ursula's book. And that really helped me, among others, to point in a direction that I've been so grateful to pursue ever since, that it actually is possible to embrace scientific rigor and a deeply spiritual realization of the universe, like as an integrated whole. So I discovered Ursula's book just a few years after it was first published, but since then, it's become basically a recognized classic and seen by many people as sort of paradigmatic of a worldview that integrates multiple domains of knowledge into a meaningful whole. And so the book's now being republished in a revised and expanded edition, and it's got a new chapter on eco-morality and a deeper emphasis on human evolution. And so maybe if we can now spotlight Ursula. And hey, Ursula, Ray, I'm glad you're holding the book.
I got it
yet
yesterday.
Yesterday, great timing. Wow, that's so exciting. Yeah. Well, congratulations on that. It's just so wonderful to have that book reissued. And I'm just so looking forward to our conversation. And just before we start off, just so everyone knows the kind of structure of the next 75 minutes. It's a 75-minute session. We'll start off with a two-way conversation, but after about half an hour, we'll open up the floor to questions from all of you. So these are called live interactive conversations. So when the time comes, please put up your Zoom hand, and everyone knows by now, right? The thing at the bottom that says reactions, and put your Zoom hand up, and we'll ask you to spotlight and ask your question directly. But if you prefer not to be so public like that, then write your question in the chat anytime in the next half hour, and we'll try to catch those. And I'll try to incorporate and ask those questions to Ursula anyway. So just so you understand how that's going to work. So Ursula, I'd love to turn to you now. And I wanted to begin maybe with a little bit of some personal background as to how you came to basically write this book in the first place. And I love in the original introduction you gave to your first edition, you have this wonderful passage about your father, who actually, it was just amazing. He started out as a Methodist preacher, then he became a professor of history of religion, and he started off his undergraduate course, as you said, by saying, "I do not believe in God." And then years later, you said he admitted, "Well, I still pray devoutly." So I love the way that this kind of has this confluence of almost like contradictions, but they kind of come together. And it looks like you inherited some of those interminglings of these different pathways in your own life and in the book. So perhaps you can talk about just how that happened to you. Like, how did your personal trajectory come to this place of going from science to a place of spirituality?
Okay, well, first of all, hi everybody, and I'm honored to be here. It's really been so cool to be participating with Jeremy and getting DTN going, where I've done a minuscule part, but have had a little group about a religious naturalist orientation that Jeremy and I kind of started quite a few years ago. So my dad was raised in an intensely Victorian Methodist scene, and I wasn't, so I didn't have the kinds of back and forth yo-yo stuff that he had to deal with. I was just raised sort of in a home where, Christmas we sang carols, and I went to the local congregational church, but Dad wasn't, certainly not trying to get me to be a Christian. And that went through for a long time until a little while ago. When you're 80 years old, then a little while ago seems kind of weird. But I started thinking about the questions that ultimately led me to write the book, and they are, hey guys, grandma's doing a Zoom call. Please don't come in. Grandsons and dating. So I wrote the book sort of the first time not really knowing what I was doing. This time I've had a lot more tutoring and reading and stuff to make, I think, a much richer and deeper book than the first one. But the first one was my first start.
And one of the things I'm curious about, because to me, I see this conflict that still is there in a lot of mainstream thinking between science and religion. But I was curious. It sounds like you were able to come out with a book without going through too much turbulence. Did you feel supported by other scientists around you? Did you ever get any some sort of scientist of repute saying something like Jacques Monod to you, saying, "What are you doing talking about sacredness in science?" Or did people just really embrace it?
Yeah, I think Richard Dawkins had some online comment about it. I can't remember what he said. It wasn't pleasant, but that's Richard. And I admire a lot of what he does, just not the selfish gene was obviously a stupid idea. But in general, it was just kind of like I had this other life. And there was one scientist who kind of almost slithered up to me and said, "I read your book." And I said, "What did you think?" And he said, "Oh, I loved it, but I can't believe you had the nerve to write it." And so I don't know whether he was voicing the feelings of a lot of people or not, but most people just kind of didn't pay any attention to it because they were too busy doing their science. But there was a lot of interest in the book and in these ideas, and we ultimately started something that we call the Religious Naturalist Association, where you were an early member thereof, and we have been developing it ever since.
Yeah. And so I'd love to sort of maybe go a little deeper into that confluence of those two, of the science and the kind of spiritual sensation. There's this phrase you use in the book, a covenant with mystery, that I just love, because it sounds deeply religious. And yet you're coming from this scientific perspective. And there was actually a quote that was in the initial edition, and it's still there in the new one, that I actually quoted in my first book, The Patterning Instinct, when I was talking about how it's possible to embrace these two together. And I just want to read it to you because it meant so much to me. You wrote how you can develop a deep understanding for like the notes and strings of the keys of life. And you wrote, as a cell biologist immersed in these understandings, I experience the same kind of awe and reverence when I contemplate the structure of an enzyme or the flowing of a cascade as when I watch the moon rise or visit Machu Picchu. Same rush, same rapture. To me, that was just so profound because it really captured this sense of the incredible mystery of what science unfolds. But I'd love, was there ever, maybe if you could tell us if there was ever a moment when that realization came to you, like, oh, this is the same thing, or was it just something that just felt natural to you always, or was there some kind of realization that you had at some point?
There was no St. Paul on the road to Damascus moment. I can tell you, I mean, it just kind of kept thinking about it and it made more and more sense. I had a wonderful tutor in the form of a philosopher named Loyal Rue, who had previously written a book that he called A Mythia, where he bemoans the fact that the traditional religions are no longer interesting to lots of people, but there was nothing that was replacing them as a cultural glue, and that he thought that our scientific understandings were that glue. And here he was, of course, echoing Thomas Berry, for example, although it turns out he never even knew about Thomas Berry or vice versa. But
really?
So, yeah, so a lot of people converged on this, and I joined the group and was very much helped out by all the other people who were thinking the same way. So yeah, I just it just made more and more sense to me.
Yeah. And so, as you mentioned, in fact, I think you wrote in the introduction to this new edition, after the book was published, you said, I acquired a second life. And so perhaps you can tell us more about what drew you to actually want to sort of co-found the Religious Naturalist Association, which for anyone who's got a sharp mind, you might notice that the initials of that is RNA, and I think you've said that's not by coincidence, if I understand that right.
Intentional pun.
Right. So yeah,
I'm sorry, I lost track of the question.
Well, so what led you to want to actually create this association, and what was that experience like, and what do you try to accomplish with the RNA?
Yeah, well, we came up with this idea of calling what we're doing the religious naturalist orientation, and it sometimes is expressed as an ism, a religious naturalism, but there isn't really an ism in any of this except the understandings of nature. That nature is the reality. Okay, so if you need an ism, use nature. And so those of us who were developing and exploring religious and spiritual responses to this story called ourselves religious naturalists, and we didn't really have a home. We were kind of bonging around, and improbably a lawyer from Louisiana set up this 501c3 to form an association that people could join who were interested in finding out more about it. Was really our come on. And that was in 2014. And, we now have 1,000 members in 50 countries, 50 states, and all sorts of things. So there are lots of people who are interested. You have lots of people here, lots of overlap between memberships, actually. So the idea, though, is that a religious naturalist is taking nature not only to mind, not only understanding the basics of how the world works, how life works, how we all came to be, but also taking nature to heart, pulling these understandings into their spiritual and their moral frameworks. And that's an ongoing process, and people who are doing it, like me, are really enjoying it.
Yeah, and that seems this kind of focus on what it feels like, I think, is key. Like one sort of thing I saw how you look at this kind of new potential for an integrated worldview is you talk about this distinction between two different elements, like looking at a sense of how things are, like a story of how things are, and then a story of which things matter, like leading to morality and values. And what I'm curious about is how those two interact in your mind. It seems like the feeling tone, like you say, I think you say at some point that cosmology only resonates if it makes a listener feel religious. And do you think it's the feeling which leads to that sense of what things matter in morality or values, or is there something more around that switch? Because we can all say, okay, great, we live, this is the story, that it's a great but why does it matter to us, and why should it matter to us?
Okay, well, the how things are and which things matter was Loyal Rue's framing of it. I would put something in the middle: how things are, how we feel about it, and which things matter. Because that middle piece is, of course, key to helping us move on to taking care of what matters. So that middle piece, I feel comfortable calling it the spiritual response. Awe, wonder, gratitude, humility, reverence toward the natural world and its beings and its history. And then once one takes in this story that we call everybody's story and has these spiritual connections with it, then to my mind, which things matter, the moral part is kind of a no-brainer. I mean, if you think that all of this stuff is terrific, then of course taking care of it is what you do next. And so one of the things that I like so much about thinking this way is that you don't need to come up with justifications for why you should take care of the planet or why you should be worried about climate change. Of course you should.
Right, yeah. And well, in fact, you added this new chapter in this new edition on eco-morality. And in fact, and I think you said somewhere like that you have basically an agenda for this book to outline some possible foundations for a planetary ethic. So perhaps can you give us a little bit more detail on what that planetary ethic actually means, and how people might live according to it?
Well, I threw out even in the first edition this, completely off the wall claim that I thought that the only way we were ever going to get anywhere with forging a sustainable and not crazy trajectory forward was to take these understandings of nature seriously, take them to heart, understand how the world works, understand how climate works and how it's important to ecosystems, all of those understandings that they collectively could, and to my mind, I went ahead and said should be the basis for conversations, for summit meetings, for diplomacy. I mean, it just seems, and what I am very careful to say in doing that is to not say, okay, so if we do that, then we can scrub all the traditions, we can scrub everything, it's going to be this homogeneous thing. That's not at all what I'm saying, just the opposite, in fact. To my mind, our religious traditions, our cultural traditions, our ethnicity, all of those things are part of nature. They're not outside of nature. And to bring them into who we are and how we think about the world is really where it's at.
Yeah.
So, and not only that, even though some of the premises of some of those traditions may not resonate with many of you anymore, they all have a great deal of wisdom. And as Jeremy lifts up, particularly in his book, The Web of Meaning, which, by the way, is a wonderful book. Everybody should buy it and read it. We cover a whole lot of the same stuff. The Asian traditions and the indigenous traditions are, of course, particularly deep and wise in their understandings of the natural world and how everything is interconnected and how we all depend on each other.
Yeah, well, so let me, on that topic, let me move to what I think is one of the more challenging areas of this kind of intersection, because I mean, it's nice. And there's obviously the big ecumenical tradition of saying basically all the major faiths ultimately come from the same source of the sense of connecting with divinity and the golden rule and caring for others. And that's one way which part of me shares that understanding. But then basically, I spent a lot of time in that earlier book, The Patterning Instinct, which looks at the history of how people have made meaning, to look at the dualism of some of the major faiths that now account for the majority of people on the earth, like basically the Abrahamic faith, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And they basically say actually the source of value, the source of the ultimate source of meaning and value is somewhere in this other dimension. There is this eternal dimension. There's God, and so basically the world becomes this kind of despiritualized place, this sort of stage on which the great sort of story of humanity takes place. But even the human being themselves is being split between, I've got a soul and a body, and the body is like a prison to the soul, like from some of the ancient Greek thoughts that then Christianity inherited. And so the whole point of everything is to be ascetic and just do the right thing for the soul, because you'll spend eternity in heaven. And there's a lot of that, in my view, that works against the very nature, this integrative sacredness of life and nature that you describe so well in your book. So I'm curious, and I think a number of people, when even they look at the word religion, might, in fact, I've had a little bit of allergy to that word because it's so associated with the more mainstream sort of accepted orthodox religions, rather than the word spirituality, which is a little bit more sort of general or whatever. And I know we've talked about that before, and we can come to that. But first off, how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile some of those fundamentals of dualistic thought in those mainstream religions?
Well, they're there. They don't speak to me. I call myself a non-theist rather than an atheist, because to my mind, an atheist has a belief about God, which is that there isn't one. And I call myself a non-theist because just that whole theistic idea of there being some creator that's looking over at me and answering my prayers and everything just never worked. So as you well know, and probably all the people here know, there are plenty of religious traditions that don't have such a monotheistic God. Notably, those from Far East Asia, where that's just not part of one's religious thinking at all. So there are folks for whom that's important, and there it is. I'm not in any way in the business of trying to talk somebody out of what faith conclusions they've come to. What we're trying to offer is basically something better. That rather than criticizing what is, we say, okay, go for it if you like, but here's what we're doing. And we feel that it has a lot of religious potential. And what do you think?
Yeah.
And let me just also say that religion is a noun, religious is an adjective. And maybe I'm just being schoolmarmy here, but there's a really big difference between those two words. Yeah.
And in fact, we've talked earlier one time, last year sometime, about this question of the choice of the words of spirituality versus religion. And you made some really good points about the etymology of religion being and why that enables you to kind of embrace that as a word. Do you want to just talk about that?
Sure. Well, religion,
about why you feel it's okay.
Religare in Latin, it means binding together. It's the same as ligament, and it refers to the role that the religious traditions have played throughout human history to bring together a group, a tribe, a nation, whatever was adopting that particular tradition to better function, to train their children. Loyal Rue put it, religions are about training the social emotions that we inherit from our social lineage, and the religions then just tell people how to call upon those social emotions to behave as functional and loving members of the community.
Yeah. And I really like that. That kind of stayed with me, that sense of that when we can see religion as the thing that kind of binds us in that way. And just before we move on from this kind of concept of what words to use or whatever, I'm curious about your thoughts about pantheism, because I know you quoted Albert Einstein on more than one occasion, I think, in your book, and he has this wonderful, and some people may not know, Einstein was a follower of Spinoza, who is maybe viewed as the first in the West, at least, the first pantheists. And he says, we followers of Spinoza see our God in the wonderful order and lawfulness of all that exists and in its soul as it reveals itself in man and animal. And Einstein, I think, called himself a pantheist. And sometimes I've sensed if I had to put a label on myself, it might be that, pantheism, just seeing a divinity in all of life, whatever we might want to say about divinity. And I just wondered if you ever, like how you feel about that term pantheism versus the
it's Baskin and Robbins. There's 20 however many flavors of how one uses, in particular, God language. I mean, so a theologian named Gordon Hoffman called God serendipitous creativity. Okay, Tillich called it God, the ground of being. The pantheists talk about God being in all of the natural world, and I just find that God language gets in my way. So because it has so many meanings and it is so can be confusing, misleading as to what it is that you're talking about. If you don't talk about God, if you talk about and to say that the depths of nature are sacred, that is a real gaudy kind of term. Only one can talk about sacred without talking about a guy in the sky.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. So let's shift then to what actually this can mean. And when we look at basically this existential crisis that our civilization is facing, which I would argue has at its deepest roots comes actually from some of those dualistic splits, that sense of nature as being separate from us as humans and just being this resource to exploit rather than that sense of that divinity. So I guess one first question I have for you is, do you believe that there is as kind of an ontological shift that's actually taking place in the global human consciousness about the way of relating to nature? Do you think that more and more people are actually recognizing the sacredness, or do you feel we're not even kind of close to starting to shift that?
I have no idea. I mean, when a lot of times we get responses from people who are joining RNA and they say, "Wow, this is the way I've always felt. I just didn't have a name for it." And to given whatever we are, 8 billion people on the planet, many of whom are completely embedded in their traditions of origin and have never even heard of this stuff. It's certainly premature to say that there's been a global shift. But I would like to say that those of us who are helping people explore this idea, we keep finding people who are excited and very relieved that they can call the way they approach their existential questions, that they can give it a name.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And let me just say to people, by the way, is in the next a few minutes from now, we're going to be moving towards opening the space up for other people to share their questions or comments. So feel free at this point, if you've got something you want to say, if you'd like to ask it early on, to put your hands up, and we'll kind of create a line. And again, if you'd rather not speak publicly, add a question in the chat, so that we can also, access your ideas that way. But I do, here obviously on the DTN, the DTN stands for the Deep Transformation Network. And it's really a network of people that share this recognition that we need to change things dramatically. And also that we need deep transformation. So one of the questions I have, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it. I'm not saying any one of us has the answer to this, but when we're looking at deep transformation, there's kind of a question: can this deep transformation that we need actually take place within the current dominant worldview, or do we need more and more people to really actually experience some sort of paradigm shift in order to change their values? Like you say, once you once you have that paradigm shift, then it begins to be natural. Well, of course, I want to devote myself to trying to save life's complexity, but without that shift, will we have any chance of making the kind of transformation that's needed this century, do you think?
I mean, I don't need to tell you or any of the people here in DTN that it's really complicated, right? I mean, there are so many parameters. There's poverty, there's capitalism, there's climate. I don't know their dominant view is anything that I could even describe in a paragraph or even a page or even an essay. I mean, there's just that's one of the reasons, I guess, why this very Pollyanna idea of, gee, why don't we all just become religious naturalists and have at least a global ethos, is one that I don't feel embarrassed about making, because at the moment there isn't really, it's as Loyal said, it's amythia. There is no global myth that one could even begin to articulate. And I don't think that things like capitalism and greed and all of that, those aren't myths. A myth is a large story, a large understanding. And, you know,
yeah, see, I
whatever you can
yeah.
and screw everybody else, that's not a myth. That's just bad behavior.
Yeah, I'd like to think that's the case, but I personally do see it as more of a myth. I mean, it's really a self-contained worldview with value orientation. It basically says, you know, we are all separate from each other, and so the right thing to do is to like make as much money as you can. And it has its own high priests who are basically not spiritual people, but the economists, and people turn to the economists to find out what should we do, and we need to grow GDP, because that. So to me, there is this kind of complex myth and story that has to be transformed, and that's personally why I do feel your kind of work is so important, not just because it can attract people one-on-one, one by one, who feel that and then get moved to it, but because there has to be, at least I feel, a real way in which larger swaths of people get to sense there is a different story, that and so many people say, we need a new story. You, I feel, in your book are offering a significant portion of that new story. That's why
you offer it. You offer it in yours. You offer it in Web of Meaning. I want to keep lifting that up, because there are, you know, a bunch of us who are saying this, and I mean, it may take 100 years, it may take 5 years, I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
we've often thought, gee, what if, you know, Barack Obama joined the RNA and began giving lectures all over the world about how great this was. That would be a shift, right? Or came on to DTN for that matter and started telling everybody how he felt about deep transformation. So a lot of things you can't predict as to how they're going to go.
Yes, and
we do the best we can.
Well, why don't we turn to I see a number of people have got their hands up, and some people are putting questions in the chat too, which is great. So let's begin with Shans, who had his hand up early on. You want to, if we can spotlight Shams, you want to share your question? Oh, I should say, by the way, sorry, before you start, just to remind everybody, and to, you know, please keep your question or comment, you know, fairly contained. We want to really make sure we hear you, and we want to make sure we have time to hear everybody. So just be aware of the space of other people out there. So Shams, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for hosting this forum, and Ursula, I'm totally consonant with everything that you've said. I want to point out that the mystics and Gnostics of all traditions, including Far Eastern traditions, I don't know what the word would be, any duality or differences that may have appeared in the conventional form of their tradition, by becoming porous, by open all, which is the universal solvent. So really my is, there's a lot been said about understanding, and of course it's critical, but the allowing, the vulnerability to allow oneself to be pierced by what's actually here seems to me key in transformation. And it hasn't been present here, but our actual condition as we are right here on the planet is exceedingly dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that yes, people will come together through shared understanding, but this opening to be pierced by the reality we are perceiving and recognizing what's here, allowing ourselves to feel it, seems to me very critical. I wonder what you think of that.
I think that's very nicely said. And one of the things that I try to lift up is that it's not only understanding it and experiencing it and feeling it, but it's also giving assent to it. I think a lot of people haven't yet realized that assent, which is, of course, a very important concept in many traditions, is one that if one brings that to one's understanding of reality, if one says, okay, this is how it is, we're made of matter, matter is 5% of the universe, all of these understandings, if we say, okay, so how else would I want it to be? I mean, what would I be like, want to be made of differently than this incredible stuff called matter? It's connecting with the piercing and saying namaste to it, that I think is a very deep part of a religious life.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question, Shams. And let's turn to Mark Green.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, how are you, Ursula?
I'm
Nice to
fine.
see you.
I'm not sure we've ever talked in person before, but
I mean, I obviously agree with the general thrust of, the conversation that we've been having here. I feel, though, that because of the urgency of the emergency that we are up against, that turning thought into action is really the important catalyst at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
I see thought leaders all over the world in a variety of different configurations talking about how we need to make a shift. But ordinary people are less interested in an intellectual idea than they are in having an activity that's meaningful in their lives. I created a spiritual path called atheopaganism, and it draws on rituals from the pagan community, from neo-paganism, and applies a naturalistic worldview to it. So its values are around reverence for the earth, but it has rituals and holidays and community. And I think that community building around those kinds of activities is really essential for us at this time, because, we can talk about it forever. Those of us that see the problem. And I'm wondering, what is RNA doing towards, or DTN doing towards implementation of this in terms of creating communities of concern?
well, the leadership in RNA has been talking about this since we started. I'm, as you know, a great fan of atheopaganism and what you're doing, and it resonates with a lot of people. And I hope all of the people here will check out your website and see if it works for them. I think that what I'm hoping is that there are going to be all sorts of participatory groups. There are, if you go to our website, we have something called related groups, and there's, church in the wild. There's Jennifer Morgan is doing great things with trying to get understandings to be taught in the schools. There are lots of groups that are making specific activities be important. And of course, that's a hallmark of DTN. That's what everybody here is trying to actually participate in doing stuff. In the second edition of the book, this last chapter that Jerry mentioned on eco-morality, I very much lift up the fact that what is important, I guess this would be politically, is just getting engaged in your local crisis, whatever it might be, and everybody has a local crisis. But what one does for ritual, I think, is very much going to be a part of who that person is. For me, ritual is taking a walk in the woods, standing by the ocean. For many people, it's meditative practice. For your group, it's participating in pagan ritual. These are all centering things. I think they're all terrific, and have are not in conflict at all with what we're trying to promote. If you think differently, let me know.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and let me add something on that too, Mark, is actually, and I see that Michelle Merrill had just put in the chat a note about her group, Nova Sutras, this looking at something similar. And actually, Michelle and Ursula have been in conversation, realizing that here on DTN, we have multiple groups. And since we have multiple groups on eco-spirituality, they said, well, why don't we create a collection of eco-spirituality groups so that people can actually, see the one that might appeal to them the most, or it also interact between the groups. So something I invite you to do, Mark, is if you're interested, is to explore this a bit more, maybe get in touch with Ursula and Michelle, and totally invite you to actually put your group there in that eco-spirituality collection as a forum to attract other people in the DTN who might be very interested in what you offer. So
great. That sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Excellent. And before we turn to you, Jesse, just wanted to ask one of the questions that's been coming in the chat. This one's from Olivia and kind of relates a little bit to something you were just talking about, Ursula, in terms of where you personally get that sense of that spiritual connection. She asks, did some of the book's content come from inner knowledge? And she wrote contemplation, meditation, introspection, feeling, as opposed to the things that you read and learned from others. So she was curious about your own, where that came from in terms of your own practices. And
sure, to me, that's a total loop. I learned things from others. They go into my thinking and feeling systems. I ponder them as I walk through the woods. They raise questions that might take me to more reading or more different kinds of rituals. This is all a process. And that's one of the things that I find most exciting about it, actually, is that there isn't a set of things that you're supposed to believe and do, but an exploration.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And just as a reminder to people as they're sharing their questions or comments, to make sure to hold space for all the other people who have their hands up, so not to take too much time. Let me turn to Jesse. You want to be spotlighted and share? Hi, Jesse. Good to see you.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Great to hear this approach. I'm a natural systems scientist and discovered something about physics that really started my research 40 years ago, that physics didn't study the beginnings and endings of things. So it doesn't recognize growth as an organizational process, and so doesn't know what too much growth can do, as we see in our world today, that we've been following a rule that is the most profit, and using the profit to multiply the use of the physics tools. But in our own lives, we know when relationships are going sour pretty easily. We're aware of the context, we see the changes and we feel them. And but rules don't do that. They have no sensors. They have no feelings. So it seems to me that if our whole world is following a set of rules for how to manage itself, which does seem to be the rule of growth, is so universal and is a rule of multiplying uses of things, that it should be as evil a thing as could be to apply that to the future of humanity, and our place on Earth, to endlessly follow an unfeeling rule that we should give the people who use it some feeling so that they can understand their context shifting and souring, so they know to stop that.
That's very nicely said. Did you have, was there a question in there that I missed?
No, just
A comment?
yes. A question is,
Yeah. Mhm.
you say it's nicely said. How would you use it?
What is nicely said? Though I got missed.
If what I said was,
How would I
correct.
use it? Well, I think that how I would respond is that you have described a rule, but of course it is not a rule that comes from Mother Nature herself. It's a cultural rule. It's a rule that is now dominant in particularly Western cultures and those who are wannabe Western cultures, but it's certainly not a rule in terms of how ecosystems work. It's not a rule in how evolution came to be. And so it's a rule that we have to get rid of.
well, actually, every organism and every culture and every natural system begins following a rule like maximizing the extraction of resources to develop, but then nature has a nice simple trick for turning that around. That's what I would talk to you if you wrote me or something. There's a lot more to that, but it's a simple trick and it could be taught.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jesse. Thanks. And let me turn to another question from the chat. Actually, changes topics just slightly. It's from Nat Dyer in London. And the question is, can you say more about, you'd said early on how Richard Dawkins' selfish gene was a terrible idea. And he asked if you could say more about that and how does it differ from your view of how evolution works?
Okay, well, this is, in the book, but and you have made exactly the same critique in your book. So and many others have as well. I mean, DNA, the genomic DNA has the instructions for how to make that particular kind of creature, and it's some 10,000 genes, 20,000 genes, whatever. And I think of the genome in each cell as a set of instructions sort of in the back of the room, and the cell is going around doing things. And when it's time to change the operational parameters because it gets too hot or too cold or something has gone wrong, it goes to the DNA and tweaks it. The proteins turn off certain genes, turn on certain genes, and regulate their expression, and new things happen. So a DNA is a great resource in the back of the room, but DNA that doesn't code for anything that's alive is DOA. I mean, it doesn't have anything to contribute and is nothing. It's the cell and then the organism and then the ultimately ecosystem that is calling the tricks, and the cells keep calling on DNA to help them out. So the DNA is in no way selfish. That's, it's, and it replicates because an enzyme called DNA polymerase comes along and copies it. Okay, so, but the DNA polymerase is made by the cell, and the DNA is great. I would be very happy. We would not be here without it, but it is not selfish. And the important way to think about life, from my perspective, is to think about the proteins, the cascades, the all of the regulation, the feedback that allows this DNA to keep on switching on and off when it's called upon.
Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining that so clearly, Ursula. Yeah. And like, if I could just say one thing, not as a biologist myself, but just somebody who's studied some of these ideas and read about them so much in terms of systems thinking, that I kind of, in a way, we can see it's so important to see the whole thing as a set of interactive processes. So we can even see life itself, not as a thing, but basically as this kind of emergent phenomenon coming from all these processes that Ursula was just describing. This kind of cascade going on for billions of years. And that to me is where Dawkins is so fundamentally wrong and dangerously wrong, in the sense that of kind of reducing it to specific sort of building blocks rather than focusing our attention on that whole process itself. Anyway, just
well, the building block, I mean, you have a nice defense of reductionism in your book, and I want to pile onto that. I mean, yeah, it's made up of a living cell. An amoeba is made up of, you know, hundreds of thousands of different kinds of proteins and metabolic pathways and so on. They're all there, and we can look down and we can see, as scientists, as biologists, we can follow what's going on down there. It's fascinating. It's where I live. But then what emerges from that is something else, which is the organism itself, that is negotiating its environment and interacting with other critters.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Ursula, for clarifying that. And let's turn to Catherine Alexander there. Hey there, Catherine. Good to see you.
Oh, it's so good to see you, and it's so good to hear this discussion. I really appreciate it a great deal, and I appreciate you, Jeremy, for making this possible. I've been so excited personally about the intersection between science and what I really see as spirituality. I think so much of what science is now saying is something that spirituality has said before, but it sounded like story. It didn't sound like it was rooted in reality in some way. Even the "we are all one" is nice. Everybody says it, but what does it actually mean? And when you come to science, you really see those real things. But I also really share the sense of urgency that we need to take action. We need to begin to apply these things. And Ursula, that's my question to you, because I'm part of RNA. I have been interested in the intellectual discussions that everybody's had, but they're all in the air. And I'm wondering what there is that maybe RNA might bring forward that is more substantial, that is more real, really engaging with some of the issues that we have today from this perspective to slightly shift the understanding. I don't think it's such a major shift from living on the planet to living with the planet. I mean, it's, you know, small, but it's huge at the same time. And I think that's what you bring. You bring this sense of the closeness of the reality to the talk we've had, but it needs to be tweaked. So I'm just wondering what RNA is doing.
Okay,
what
RNA started out as 3 people, okay, just like DTN started out as 1. All right, our mission statement, if you will, was just to help people know about this orientation and its possibilities, and to let people know that there's a community of others who feel the same way. And to go to the next step is something that, for example, Jeremy has done with really trying to focus on particular projects, you know, permaculture, various kinds of energy retrieving programs besides fossil fuels. And there are lots and lots of places where that is being discussed. It's being discussed here. It's being discussed in Nature Conservancy. It's being discussed at 350.org. There are many, many associations that are doing this with staff, with money, with funds that we don't have. I think we have $500 in the bank or something like that. So it's not that we don't want to do it. It's one that our present circumstances are such that we can't really launch anything on the lines that you're talking about. But I would say that there are a lot of people who are doing that. And what we try to do is lift up, hey, go out, join DTN, glean vegetables from your local garden. I mean, there are many things that one can do that doesn't need an association like RNA to tell you about. You just go do it.
Yeah, really like that, Ursula. It makes me think of, to me, what's so inspiring is this, once we recognize all these things as this kind of complex, interconnected systems, and the system is self-organized, that the works we do to sort of amplify those connections, we don't even know how important they can be because of the non-linearity of this whole thing. And so, you know, something like your book can be out there and then inspire somebody you've never heard of in some other continent who just comes across it and then goes, right, this is the thing that's going to lead me to this other place. And so all of us, all we can do is not try to be the ones so we can see ourselves moving the needle, but just really question always, how can we take what is most precious to us and use that for this movement towards transformation? And just as importantly, how can we amplify the work of others? Because that's how the transformation ultimately will happen. Yeah, thanks, Ursula. Wanted to go to another question from the chat. This is from Michael Lennon, and he writes, finite ideas, mindsets, and language often block the experience of awe, wonder, and gratitude. And so his question is, how do you invite others to reorient or center their attention in order to kind of recognize what is beyond? Yeah, I think that was
well, that's sort of what my book is about, I guess.
Yeah.
So I tried to do that. That's the idea, is to help people with the knowledge, because if you don't know something, to my mind, if it's one thing to think that a tree is beautiful, but I think that to give a tree full respect, you have to know how it works. You have to understand what's happening inside it. Only then can you say that you really have the tree in your mind and heart and respond to it appropriately. It's a metaphor I once used. A lot of people go into the woods and love nature and come back and say they understand nature. And I'm not putting down those thoughts at all. Those are wonderful thoughts and feelings, but there's a little bit of it, to me, like taking a cruise ship to Guatemala and getting off and walking around for a few hours and buying a few postcards and getting back on the cruise ship and saying that you know Guatemala. I mean, it's the tree, its nature all the way down, that is, to me, the most satisfying and the most real.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I find so powerful in your work, Ursula, because like in my book, I talk about the need for like an integrated consciousness. Like we've got these two ways of understanding. We have a conceptual consciousness and an animate consciousness. And oftentimes people feel one or the other is the right one. So to take your analogy, we could say, oh, you could have somebody study Guatemala, the history, the language, everything, and never actually go there. They might really understand Guatemala very well conceptually, but not have it in their body. Somebody might live there for years, but without the intellectual understanding, might not have, but that true integrated understanding actually takes both. And it's not easy, but to my mind, that's the way that offers a full integrated way of living in the earth, which is kind of what we need as a human species. So, I mean, that's one of the things I appreciate so much in your book, that you're leading us to that place. So let's turn to Elliot. And Elliot, if we can spotlight you, if you have, yeah, great, we get to see you too.
Hi, I want to just try and tie together a few themes that I think I'm hearing with the work that we do here that is we call it's hyper-local organizing. Really, it's not really about trees. It's not really about the sky. It's about this tree. It's about that creek. It's about that hill. And I'd be very grateful to be able to share some of the stories that we're beginning to build with other people with similar stories about what's happening in your community, on your stretch of creek, with your hill, and the people in that place. Because one of the things that we're finding is our local community, people you might not kind of expect to have any kind of non-standard understanding, or you might kind of superficially think are quote unquote mainstream, et cetera, or kind of tied into the existing paradigm. If you begin to talk about this particular creek or this particular hill, immediately evokes that sense of feeling connection, and that can be a way in which we can build a deeper understanding of the both the spirit and the patterning complexity. So I'll just share that. And again, we're fortunate to have some tribal partners who have a deep kind of connection with our land here, able to share that with current residents as well as people who have been here for many generations, and finding that kind of common love and common spirit of connectivity, as well as kind of some of the best natural science to bring to the issues that we're facing as well.
And where are you joining us from, Elliot?
We're in Lake County, which is about 2 hours north of San Francisco in California. Surrounding, we're in an upland on a mountainside, kind of feeding the largest, one of the oldest lake in North America, Clear Lake, and facing some challenges on imminent extinction of culturally significant species that have kind of drawn us into a project of organizing around creek and stream restoration. Mm-hmm. And that's been kind of a portal to connect to the community in a very deep way.
Yeah, fantastic. And feel free to share more on the DTN itself about what you're doing there. Sounds great. I don't know, Ursula, if you had anything to...
No, just, Margaret Mead is said to have said nothing ever happens to change anything except a few local people. And that's, that has to be the way it is. It's also important to donate and to support the larger groups that are trying to get big things to happen and influence legislation and so on. Right. But in the end, it's that creek running through your town that is your job. And next town is another one. And if everybody were doing that, man, it would make a big difference. And a lot of people are.
And one of the things that, just to kind of continue to make that connect, one of the things that we're finding is, of course, that the more unified and interconnected and collaborative we are at that local hyper-local level, that enables us to make the connections up the hierarchies to our county, to the state, and kind of gives us the opportunity to make use of whatever resources are there for larger scale organizations, whether they're...
And I think it's very important to lift up that many of the religious traditions, including many of the monotheisms, are greening rapidly. Right. They have every church I've ever visited, maybe that's why they invited me there, but they have green committees, they have green projects, they have sermons. I've given sermons in many churches, many Episcopal services. So it's really important to think of the traditions not as enemies or anything of the sort, but as potential collaborators. They may love the earth because they say it's God's creation, and you may not buy into that reason, but it doesn't matter, because both you and they have identified what's important, namely the earth, and that importance and that commitment and that responsibility is what's driving people.
Great. So, yeah. Thanks for that. Great. Love to hear what you were doing there, Elliot. And Michael and Linda, I'll come to you in a moment, but I did want to highlight just an interesting interaction I see happening in a couple of messages on the chat. I think in response to what you were saying earlier, Ursula, about how important it is to sort of know how the tree works, as well as kind of connecting with the tree. And I see Aymar a few minutes ago saying, I don't believe I need to fully understand how every tree works to know this is where I live and what matters to me in this animate earth. And just to add perspective, Janet just also shared in the chat. Sorry, I think I agree a bit with Aymar. Embodied spiritual connection with sacred nature arises in different people in different ways. Although when it comes to action, we can make some big mistakes if we don't understand how things actually work. What advice do you two have for the majority of people who live in cities and can only connect with nature as sort of, quote, tourists, by the way? So just this perspective, just wanted to see what your thoughts are in relation to those two questions or points.
Okay, well, city dweller might well have cats and dogs who are, sentient beings that one can learn a huge amount from about how life works and how we humans work in that context of relating to other animals. Most cities I know of have parks. There are, when I was a little girl, all that I had for nature was just this little backyard and a place where I used to dig and plant stuff and everything. It doesn't have to be the Sierras. Nature is there everywhere and can be felt and related to and embodied without being necessarily the most beautiful thing you've ever seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. And one thing I'd add to that, by the way, is we also can recognize that nature is within ourselves. I mean, we are nature. And so to me personally, that's where a lot of meditation and embodied practices like Tai Chi or Qigong can be so valuable. I mean, just again, speaking from my own experience, that for me was transformative to make me realize one of the sort of crucial insights I've had in my life was I am life. It's not like life is out there and I've got to do something for life, but life is basically showing itself, manifesting in me as an organism, just like all the others. And that's kind of what deeply connects us. But I do think this is a really, by the way, a crucial topic. And I don't think we can even begin to touch on it now. But when we look at the potential for a future ecological civilization or true life-affirming civilization, we have this paradox that actually cities and dense cities are the best way for humans, as the billions of us on the earth, to have the least impact on the overall global system. And you have people like E.O. Wilson pushing for this notion of half Earth. We need to keep half of Earth just to be wild, let it do its thing. And there is some, so to me, this is an important question of how do we both connect with nature, because it's only when we're really connecting with all of life on this glorious earth that we want to preserve it. But then if we're living in cities, do we do that virtually? I don't believe so personally, because I think you lose so much. Are there ways to have humans interact with life without creating these mass tourism parks that then destroy it? I think this is a big question that has to be explored in more detail. So I'm glad it got raised. So thank you. And let's turn to Michael, patiently with your hands up for a while there.
Oh, thank you very much, Jeremy. I want to kind of put to you both two questions, and they're very, kind of disparate questions. One is, in terms of what Ursula's saying, I'm thinking of Darwin, and I'm thinking of Darwin's family, and they were Unitarian Universalists. So I wonder if we could call this a kind of eco universalism. The other thing about Darwin is Darwin lost his faith, and that was a religious experience for him. That's odd to put it that way. But when he looked into the heart of what survival of the fittest meant, he was like Kurtz in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. He said, "Oh, the horror, oh, the horror." And that feeling that the heart of life, there was this horror which stepped over and crushed the individuals within species relentlessly and called it evolution, horrified him. And it caused him not to believe in a benign creator or in a benignity at the heart of life. And that's a very serious position. Second thing I'd like to say, and I don't know how these things go together, but in terms of the title of your book, Jeremy, The Web of Meaning, I'm thinking again of the gods, and particularly of the Greek god, Eros, who was the god who makes connections. And that, to me, is intimately connected with meaning as it is intimately connected with love. And I think of the final canto in Dante's Paradiso, where he says, and I think he's thinking of the feminine, and I think he's thinking about physics. Says this is the gathered up in one relation, substance and accident and their relations, as one simple flame. This is the love, he said, that moves the sun and the moon and the other stars. That's very deep connection. And I'm wondering, on the one hand, on one shoulder, I have Darwin sort of losing connection as he lost his daughter. And on the other hand, we have people like Dante, like C.S. Lewis, like Jung, who point to Eros as the basis of connection and look at a transformative relationship between men and women or between the lovers as the leading edge of evolution. Well, the question comes to mind in terms of formulating the nature of that evolution is, what is the meaning by which, what is the emergent meaning by which we are being assimilated? I think that's the question that you both are asking in kind of slightly different ways. But it's important that we reduce things to an overhauled kind of question that motivates us, that it's a question which transcends us.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. That was, yeah, very profound, bringing lots of different perspectives together into one reflection. I don't know, Ursula, if you have any thoughts?
No, I liked hearing it, but nothing immediately comes to mind.
Yeah. But thank you for sharing that. That was quite an adventure in different perspectives. Thank you. And we just have a few minutes left, and I see a couple of hands up. So I think we've got time for basically 2 more questions. Let's turn to Linda, and then we'll finish with Doc. Hey there, Linda.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. We've spoken before. I'm a longtime David Bohm follower. So your web of meaning is very important to me. It really backs up a lot of my own life's work. I was shocked today, since this is about spirituality, I was really shocked today to hear on Humanity Rising, which is put out by Jim Garrison every morning, and that he had an Anglican priest on the show that he interviewed. And I was really interested, intrigued, and overwhelmed with the news that the Anglican Church has made a decision to come out of hiding and to admit to their own collusion in colonialism, in the slave trade. So they are making a huge investment in the global South. I'm a climate activist. To me, that is huge. And the other thing that I thought was so important was the idea that if you were to combine all of the world's religions in terms of the wealth that they have, they represent 1/5 of the wealth of the planet. So can you imagine if the spiritual traditions decided to jump on that and
Great.
to make an investment in helping climate justice? You know, I don't know, that to me was one of the most important things I've heard in a long time. So I just wanted to throw that out, since we're talking about spirituality in general in the world.
So to my mind, one of the most important religious naturalists on the planet right now is Pope Francis.
Yes, and that came up too. Yes.
I don't know whether everybody should read the Laudate Si. And if you Google, I've written a couple of religious naturalist takes on it that lift up the cool stuff. He uses God language. It's, there's Jesus. The whole thing is in there. Fine, but everything else is in there too. And in his earlier encyclical, he did the same kind of number on poverty and oppression by class. So he's really terrific. And needless to say, some of the folks that that report to him are not so happy about the way he expresses himself, but he's just forging ahead, and hats off to him. Another very important environmentalist is Bartholomew, who's the head of the Greek Orthodox group. And Pope Bartholomew also has incredible things to say about the importance of the planet.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I'm in awe of Pope Francis. I think he's one of the greatest forces in the world today to turn that institution around the way he is trying to do so carefully. Just amazing. Yeah, thank you. So let's finish with you, Doc, and then I'll just have a moment or two of closing remarks. Hey, Doc, if you can just keep the question really snappy, just because we're at our time. Yeah.
Yes. The closest thing to global religion that I know of is economics. Cuts across all religions, most countries. It pervades the leadership of a good many countries, especially the developed ones. And I don't think we can make headway until we find a way to undermine that global religion, present them with something that is better. And it's so bad. I remember talking to a young professor of finance not too many years ago, and he actually said if it doesn't have a dollar sign in front of it, it doesn't exist. That is closed-minded to an extreme, and it's an abstraction from reality. Maybe a pretty extreme abstraction from reality. And
okay,
so
Jeremy, let's let you close, because I also have an obligation, and I share a lot of other
right,
people.
exactly. Well,
thank you very much for those thoughts.
Thank you, Doc. And basically, as I've said earlier, I do think that the economists are like the sort of false priests of our mythos today, but
there are many versions of economics. So
right. That's true too.
The one that happens to be dominant doesn't mean that there aren't other ways.
Very true. Yeah. Thanks, Ursula. Well, really just want to thank you, Ursula, for just sharing your wisdom and your insights, and to everyone here for taking part in a rich conversation. And just want to remind people of what we had mentioned earlier. Like, Ursula has this group, the Religious Naturalist Orientation, here on the DTN. If you want to connect with her, connect with these ideas, just turn to that group if you haven't joined it already, and check out this new eco-spirituality group hub that we talked about, with this group Nova Sutras that Michelle Merrill has put up there. And we invite other people, if they're connected with other eco-spirituality groups out there, let them know about this hub. We want it to be a place where people can feel able to share these ideas, say the richness, the diversity of different perspectives, but sharing the same underlying sense of the spirituality of our world, looked at from this way where we can actually integrate reason and our felt emotions to actually move towards transformation. So thank you for all you've done towards that, Ursula. A personal thank you for what you've given me in my own journey, and look forward to seeing a lot more of you on the DTN.
Great. Same to you. Bye.
Bye.